Dilip
Yeah.
sir's mic is muted.
Dilip sir, can we start,
Okay,
sir?
it's okay.
No, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Okay. 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 So, good evening, everyone. Professor Dilip Menon, Sebastian sir and family, respected principal, our invited guests, teachers, students, and dear participants. Welcome all of you to this Subhi Memorial International webinar. I am Rajesh James here on behalf of English Department, Sacred Heart College, Devra. Tresa Sebastian was an enthusiastic student of our department. She later became a permanent faculty of the department she studied. When I joined here in this college in 2011, she was my senior. She was a very kind and a very supportive person. And as a teacher, she was loved by all her students. Her genuinity, simplicity, and commitment to teaching, in fact, made her one of the favorite teachers of the students. Although she was here only for around 5 years as a teacher, she could create an impact on students and the faculty. She was a good teacher and also a very good researcher. Above all, a great human being. And it is to her memory and charisma that we dedicate this seminar, of course, this time as a webinar. So we are extremely thankful to Professor Sebastian, her father, and our faculty for helping us to organize a seminar of this kind in memory of his departed daughter. Thank you, Sebastian sir and family. We are also thankful to other members of our faculty and also to the management and principal of our college for making this webinar possible. And we are really privileged today to have Professor Dilip Menon as a key speaker. First of all, thank you so much for being here. This is an English department, but we're extremely happy that somebody like you, who is coming from a different domain, like history. Professor Dilip is an accomplished academician, a prolific writer in the true sense of the term, and a critical theorist. And I can definitely say that he is a leading historian from India right now. And I had the privilege of going through some of his books and articles. For instance, his book, The Blindness of Insight, Essay on Caste in Modern India, is a path-breaking book among the repertoire of studies on caste in modern India. His another book, Caste, Nationalism and Communalism in India, published by Cambridge University Press, maybe the toughest publisher among the publishing group. And his recent book is called Capitalism Towards a Global History from Oxford University Press. It's a significant book among studies on capitalism. In fact, his book, Caste, Nationalism and Communalism in India, have been a great resource for me in my research on caste and cinema. So besides this, he's written a number of articles and research papers for reputed journals. So as I've been going through his major books and articles, I can definitely say he's such a brilliant writer and also an insightful thinker. And, his researches are really grounded, original, and convincing. And I would say in a period when the conventional English departments have become cultural studies department, his critical contributions on caste, culture, maybe on the notions of global south or thinking across oceans, so on and so forth, is going to be very important for our future academic adventures and researches. For instance, I was going through some of his recent lectures in different universities. I was wondering whether somebody from the literature department could profusely quote from Amitav Ghosh like him, and his perspectives were so interesting, and I mean, such a perspective would rather won't emerge from literature departments from Kerala. So before welcoming Sir, I should also foreground a very important information, in the sense that his contribution to the cultural history of Kerala is so important when it comes to his translation project called Saraswati Vijayam, which is the first novel written in a native Indian language by a Dalit writer. He found the manuscript in a colonial archive and translated it into English. So that is the academic profile of Professor Dilip Menon, and he is now currently working as a Mellon Chair of Indian Studies and Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. And apart from that, he's a humble human being, very genuine scholar, and in fact, it's very easy to talk to him, which we found usually very difficult with other scholars across the world. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation and, of course, talking to us on a very interesting topic called Global South. And in the name of the department, principal, HOD, and other colleagues, I welcome you, sir, for this seminar. Welcome, sir, and over to Professor Dilip.
Thank you, Rajesh. You said that I'm an extremely humble being. It reminded me of Winston Churchill's remark on Clement Attlee that he's a humble man with much to be humble about. And I see myself in that category. I would like, first of all, to thank you, the principal and faculty of Sacred Heart College, particularly Professor Sebastian, who instituted this lecture in honor of his daughter. And I'm honored and touched that I've been asked to deliver a lecture in her honor. So today I want to talk about something that actually takes on also from what Rajesh was saying, that we tend to kind of paint ourselves into corners, restrict ourselves to silos, where we do something called English literature, something called history, something called anthropology, and so on, without thinking about the fact that in the end, we are actually trying to understand human experience, and that requires us to engage with the world. And to engage with the world requires us to be conversant with, educate ourselves in multiple disciplines. That is not possible to understand the world as it is, given the political fault lines, given also the fact that we, as humanity, beginning to consider that the planet Earth on which we live is not guaranteed a very long life. That requires us to engage with the environment, with the notions of human destruction of the environment, and so on. So we live in complex times, and these complex times also ask us to engage with the world in a very complex manner, and to give up these little divisions into disciplines, which make sense at some level in terms of an undergraduate education, perhaps in terms of school syllabi. But once we begin to start teaching at college, once we are graduates, and we become part of that larger consideration of the world around us, I think we need to be expansive in the ways we think. So one of the problems that I'm looking at here, centrally in this lecture, is the lecture is titled Changing Theory, Concepts from the Global South. Now, this might seem very abstract, but at the heart of it is a fundamental political problem that despite the fact of colonialism having ended, many of the intellectual structures of colonialism are still in place in India. So when we do our various disciplines, which we were talking about earlier, most of the theory that we resort to comes to us from elsewhere. This was something that Tagore remarked upon in 1917 in his lectures on nationalism, where he said that we cannot afford to write our own histories through histories that come from elsewhere. And this is the problem that I really want to be taking up. And this is the question that has been what motivated my setting up of the center at the University of Witwatersrand, and also thinking from the fact that whatever thinking we do happens from a place, it happens from a moment, and the way in which we do our social sciences, the way in which we do politics, has to be influenced by the locale that we are part of and the fault lines within it. So we cannot do sociology and English literature as if we were living in England or in the United States, for example. We have to think that we are in Kerala, we are in South Africa, and this should impinge on our consciousness in terms of the kinds of questions that we ask of the disciplines that we are engaged in. So for me, one of the most significant moments was in 2016 when we had that campaign called Rhodes Must Fall, which was a campaign in the University of Cape Town on the west coast of South Africa, where there was the demand by students to take down the statue of Sir Cecil Rhodes, a well-known imperialist, but who was seen in many senses as one of the founding fathers of South Africa. So the question became, in a post-apartheid society, what did it mean to continue to deify, monumentalize, and worship large numbers of these figures who were part of a certain white colonialism in South Africa? And this movement, as you know, is now spreading all across the globe. We had instances of the Rhodes Must Fall echoing in the University of Oxford. We've had statues of slave traders being taken down in Bristol in England, statues of Confederate generals who supported slavery in the US under attack in the United States of America. But besides all of this, one of the fundamental things that was happening in South Africa 25 years after the end of apartheid was the call for decolonizing the syllabus. That the demand was not just that more people should gain access to the university. Certainly, the idea of fees must fall addressed that issue, that the university should be a democratic space, more people should have access, education should be cheaper, and so on. But more important was the question of knowledge. So once having entered the university, what is it that you study? And what did it mean to decolonize the syllabus so that one didn't study sociology and history in conventional ways? So, for example, when we study modern India in Indian universities, modern India is seen as beginning in 1757, right? The Battle of Plassey, the East India Company taking over India. And this is hugely ironic in an independent nation where India acquires modernity once it becomes a chapter in the history of England. And we need to think about this, and we need to think about longer histories. We need to think about our own histories and the moments within it, which we need to think with significantly in order to understand these temporal moments like ancient, medieval, and modern. One of the thing is that when we think about questions like this, these questions are not new, right? They have been with us for a very long time. So since this is an English literature department, one of the significant Indian intellectuals who addressed this question way back in 1995 was Professor Ganesh Devi, who began a PhD in English literature and was asked to read F.R. Lewis and the contemporary literary critics in America and England. And he said, look, India has had at least 1,000 years of engagement with literature, literary theory, aesthetics, and so on. So why is it that we don't bring this to bear on our study of literature? And he wrote a very profound book in 1995, which was called After Amnesia. And his argument was that there was a way in which colonialism created a paradigm where we forgot. We were taught to forget the intellectual resources that existed within our tradition in our attempt to hitchhike, as it were, on the narratives of Western modernity. So this idea of after amnesia is really the fact that we live after amnesia, we live as amnesiacs, we live as sleepwalkers in many senses, where we are not cognizant of, not aware of the intellectual resources from within our multiple languages, from within existing not only in secular spaces, but also in our religious spaces. So, for example, when you think about Ambedkar reaching back to Buddhism in order to argue for a reconstitution of India through Maitri or friendship. Right? The second idea that we can think with apart from Ganesh Devi's After Amnesia, is the political scientist, political theorist Sudipto Kaviraj, who used to be taught at JNU for a long time and is now at the University of Columbia. His idea of Euronormality, that there is a way in which the social sciences everywhere in the world turns towards European social theory. So whether you're in China or whether you're in you look to Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, etc., in order to actually understand the protocols of a particular discipline, the processes of social processes within your society, and there is a constant measure, right? Europe is the normal against which all our societies are evaluated. This is what he calls the idea of Euronormality, the orienting of the social sciences towards European social theory. Now, one could probably draw upon an example here or an image here that when one thinks about a compass, for example, the compass is oriented towards the north. Now, this might appear to most of us to be a fairly commonplace image, but it's important to remember that Chinese compasses are always oriented towards the south. And this is an interesting fact when we think about the normalization of the idea that the compass points north. You can get full marks in school for answering a question, which direction does the compass point? Now, the compass needle has two ends, as it were. The Chinese compass points south, and this is both a geographical orientation as well as an ethical orientation, and is part of a larger philosophy and a larger cosmology, ways of understanding the world, and so on, which we needn't get into here. So what I want to do in this lecture is to take up this problem. I mean, the ways in which our habits of thinking have been conditioned by Euronormality, and what are we to do about this, right? I mean, rather than just engaging in a critique, and we've been engaging in this critique for quite some time and haven't got anywhere very quickly. One of the important books that came out in the 90s was by the political philosopher Partha Chatterjee, called The Nationalist Thought in the Colonial World. And in that, he had a very neat argument about the stages in the evolution of nationalist thinking. There were three moments, as he characterized them. The first was the moment of departure, the second was the moment of maneuver, and the third was the moment of arrival. Now, what did he mean by this? So the moment of departure, he took up the figure of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee in Bengal. The idea was that in a colonized nation, colonized intellectuals begin to work with what they've inherited, right? In terms of these European categories, the idea of the Enlightenment traveling around the world, creating notions of secularism, individual, and so on. And they begin to formulate an argument, a rugged argument, which shows that, look, our societies need to learn from Europe. So Bankim Chandra's famous cry that India doesn't have a history, it needs a history, makes also a demand for a historical discipline that escapes from ideas of yugas and that a huge embarrassment of time that our Puranas deal with. So the moment of departure is that moment where native intellectuals begin to depart from an existing understanding of tradition. The idea of tradition comes into existence, and they begin to make that movement of synchronizing the society with these larger ideas of the modern, larger ideas of the emergence of disciplines, and so on. The second moment, the moment of maneuver, builds upon this earlier moment, but it is also the moment where there is a kind of tension emerging between the inheritance and a projection of the future. And here he takes up the figure of Gandhi, where Gandhi manages to draw upon native ideas of intellection. So think about the central idea of Gandhi, that is Satyagraha, which is drawn from Indian classical thought, Indian classical traditions. And so even though Gandhi is studied law in England, Gandhi is au fait, very conversant with the European intellectual tradition, he maneuvers with the traditions that are available to him within Indian society and Indian philosophical traditions, as readings of the Gita, for example, in order to create a social consciousness which attempts to move towards independence. But of course, this is also the point at which what Ranajit Guha, the historian, called the point at which the political movement is mobilizing people, but also disciplining them. Because the idea is of a new is ours. So this was a contradiction that was at the heart of post-colonial theory. So we need to now think about the moment of departure in a different way from which Partha Chatterjee talked about the question of arrival in the case of Nehru. So we think about another departure. So there are two moments of departure here. One is the moment of departure from colonizing pedagogy, and now we need to depart in a significant way from post-colonial theory, and it's staying within the ambit of those theories that come from elsewhere. So how do we move away from Europhone theory? European theory, Indian fact, European theory, African fact. And within India, of course, you have further complications, like Gopal Guru put it, you have Brahmin theory, Shudra fact. There is or Brahmin theory, Dalit fact, where the attempt to think about India can very easily lead us into the space of a high theory, which we see as coming from classical Indian thought, rather than drawing upon a variety of practices of intellection. Right? If you think about the enormously important work of Ambedkar draws upon a whole range of intellectual traditions, drawing upon theorists like Durkheim and John Dewey as much as Buddhism, local traditions of religion. And there's a vast landscape of thought that he draws upon in order to imagine equality. So what we need to do here is, in our moment of departure, is to think with this range of works that have been slowly emerging, where in Africa, on the continent of Africa, you have the works of many philosophers which have tried to put forward the idea of an African philosophy in particular languages, in particular spaces. In Southeast Asia, you have Huang Xingchen writing about Asia as method. Instead of thinking about the world with Europe, what would it mean to think about the world with the experience of Asia? We have works emerging from the Middle East. So you have this two brilliant books that have been written on Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud, and Marwa al-Shakri and Umnia al-Shakri, who are these scholars. They look at how Freud and Darwin are read in Arabic countries, so that Darwin and Freud don't immediately come as purveyors of knowledge. So one with the gift of psychoanalysis, to use Dipesh's word, and one with the gift of the theory of evolution, how Darwin and Freud enter a space of already existing debate, right, about self, about history, and so on. And what is important to understand is the local engagements of Arab intellectuals with this body of theory. And similarly, we can ask about questions like what are the concepts that we could think with? So we could begin to think with ideas like, okay, do we have notions of logic? Do we have notions of reason? Do we have what Europe has? Basically, that's the kind of question we could ask. Or we could ask the other question, what is it that exists in our spaces that engaging with a European philosophy might not allow us to get at? Right? So we have to think about decolonizing our mind in order to not only think with the resources, the intellectual resources that we have, but to ask ourselves, what are our questions? Right? Our questions too cannot come from elsewhere. So to ask ourselves, why is India not a capitalist country? Why has India not had the Enlightenment? These are questions that actually lead us down a path that will constantly lead us to measuring ourselves against what Europe is, rather than asking the question of what is it that we have, what are our internal logics of evolution, internal logics of history. Not that this is somehow independent and autonomous, certainly not. The world has always been a connected place for quite a while now. So if we are to think about new concepts, changing theory, producing concepts from our spaces, we have to think about word making and world making, that through the creation of these words, you're also trying to imagine other worlds, rather than the world in which we live, where there is a kind of orientation, where there is that imaginary orientation towards the north. As with the compass, what would it mean to think with the compass pointing south towards us. And how do we move from critique, right, saying that, well, we'll have nothing to do with Europe, we reject the inheritance of Europe, without understanding the implicated nature, the fact that we are colonized people, that there is a way in which our histories, our ways of thinking, our ways of being have been conditioned. Why else would I, a Malayali, be speaking to you in English, right? I mean, there are, from things as simple as that to broader issues of the connectedness of the world that has been created through the process of colonialism. So this moving from mere critique to a conversation, how do we get our traditions about which we are amnesiac, but which we have to start learning about, how do we get our traditions into conversation with these theories and ideas that come from elsewhere? This would be fundamental to the recovering from the colonial wound, as the decolonial thinkers of Latin America call it, particularly Maria Lugones has this idea of the colonial wound that we suffer from. And the question really is not of establishing one-to-one commensurability. What do I mean by that? No, there is a very reactive way in which we can think this, saying, hey, there are traditions of logic in European philosophy, we have traditions. There is an idea of reason in European philosophy, we have ideas of reason too. And it's like this constant going back and forth where we look at ourselves in the mirror held before us by Europe and we measure ourselves only against that, forgetting that there is a life around us, right, which is beyond the purview of this mirror. So this is the question that we need to talk about. And at the same time, instead of asking, does logic exist in Indian and African philosophy, you could equally ask the other kind of futile question, do notions like rasa, dharma exist in Western philosophy? And that would be another venture which would be fairly misguided. So the need for conversation is crucial, not to paint ourselves into a corner where we move into a space of autonomy, where we say, hey, Indian philosophy provides us all the answers, right? And that is the direction in which we are slowly being driven by a Hindu fundamentalism, that we possessed all the answers already, right? That everything was known to us, from surgery to atomic science to a whole host of things. And at the same time, we become forgetful of the hierarchy and violence that underlies our society. So, in our glorious society, in which we knew everything, only some people knew everything. There were whole swathes of people, the untouchables, the women, who were kept out of the space of knowledge. So, this is again something to think about, where we can't engage in a mere knee jerk reactive intellectual enterprise where we say, we had colonialism, now we must assert ourselves and be proud. Say, I am proud to be Indian. There's lots in India not to be proud about, which is why we had figures like Vivekananda, Gandhi, Pandita Ramabai, Ambedkar, who made it central to our understanding of India that we must engage in a critique before we can really arrive at an evaluation. So this question of time becomes very crucial because we are also caught up in the idea of modern and our desire to be modern. It's the obscure object of desire, as to borrow a title from one of Buñuel's films, that we're not modern enough. And very often in our understanding, urban people see themselves as more modern than rural people. Urban and rural elites see themselves as more modern than the tribal. And you could go on. There's multiple ways of creating hierarchies within society. But this question of time is crucial because we are conditioned by the idea of modernity as being that when we begin to connect with the histories of Europe. And the more and more we become like Euro-America or Europe in America, that more modern we are. So the question would be that we need to think with other temporalities. So we have to ask ourselves, how far back do we have to go in order to write a history of the present, right? Do we go back 100 years? Do we go back 200 years? Do we go back 1,000 years? And these questions are questions. It's not that I have an answer, which will give you 10 marks in your exam. How far back does one have to go to write a history of the present? The answer is 150 years. No, it's not that. This is a question that needs to press on our consciousness. And this connection, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to characterize certain periods of India as being ancient, certain periods as being medieval, certain periods as being modern, a Hindu period, a Muslim period, a British period, which is never called a Christian period, and so on and so forth. So these are questions that we need to think about in order to recover what it might be to actually move out of this, move away from the space where the colonial wound has meant that we think in categories that are being given to us, not ones that we have wrestled with, not ones that we have generated from that moment of decolonization and independence that we live in. To give you one example of this amnesia, and this is a fundamental idea to this entire lecture, Ganesh Devi's idea of after amnesia. Now, those of you who have read Western philosophy, social theory, those of you who read Foucault, those of you who read Agamben, and I know that every time France sneezes, Malayalis catch a cold, Malayali intellectuals catch a cold at least. You're all like up there. We are very much ahead in the race, so that even if we are trying to understand something that is a very particularly Malayali phenomenon, we would think, okay, what would Heidegger have had to say about this? Now, this used to be a largely Bengali phenomenon. Now it's kind of moved to Kerala as well. But let's go back to this issue of when we read a page of European social theory, very often what you have is the idea of a contemporaneity of thinkers. What do I mean by that? So you take up a page of Western philosophy or social theory, you would have Plato, you would have Augustine, you would have people like Derrida, Foucault, all of them who appear on one page, right? And the idea is that there is a kind of connection, affiliation from ancient Greece right down through to modern European continental social thought and philosophy, and that this is an invented genealogy. Now, this is something that a lot of thinkers have talked about, that it's only in the 19th century that Europe orients itself towards Greece and away from Egypt, Martin Bernal's wonderful work. So there is a way in which there is a genealogy that is created where Plato is a contemporary thinker, even though they may have lived in ancient Greece, right? And if you think about the relation between Indology, the discipline called Indology, and writing on modern India, this becomes very clear what the difference is. Those of us who do modern India very rarely, if at all, look back to traditions of thinking that come from the medieval period, the ancient period, and so on, because these are the points of caesura or breaks that have been given to us, which are our inheritance because of colonialism and certain modes of thinking. So if I were writing about contemporary political theory in India, I might draw upon Ambedkar, I might draw on Gandhi, but I would not go back to somebody go back to the Shanti Parvam, for example, in Mahabharata. I would not draw upon Kautilya's Arthashastra, because this would be seen as something that is really relevant only for a past, for ancient India. Of course, we understand that the presence of ancient India on modern India is huge, right? Which is the reason why both Periyar and Ambedkar saw fit to attack somebody called, the text of the Dharma Shastra written by Manu. Manu is not an individual, as we know, but the collection of a certain set of dicta which govern hierarchy in India, which we have inherited from the past, is used very often to justify hierarchy in the present. But in terms of thinking emancipation, there have been very few thinkers who draw upon these resources, whether we go back to the akhlaq literature in notions of ethical governance within Arabic texts in India, or we go back even further to the Arthashastra and so on and so forth. So there is a break. So Kautilya is not a contemporary for us, just as in the way that Plato is a contemporary for European thought. And here is where we begin to see the effect of colonialism in the way in which it has excised parts of our imagination. So if we have to recuperate thought, now a lot of people might say, look, if you think about Confucianism, you think about Indian thought is mired in hierarchy, so as is Confucianism and so on. It's important to remember that it takes work, right? It takes work, it takes commentary. So no one would really dismiss Socrates and Plato saying, there were people who wrote within slave societies and sanctioned slavery. Or people would not say, let's not read Immanuel Kant anymore. He was a racist. He had very racist views on Negroes, and he was very contemptuous of the intellectual capacities of women. People would say, well, he had that. He was a figure of his time, perhaps, but we need to recover much else from his thought, and this is the way in which we ought to approach the problem of Indian thought as well. That there are, all thought comes to us mired in what Kant, again, called the crooked timber of humanity, right? It comes mired in the kind of hierarchies and the violence that human beings inflict on each other. And what we have to do is a process of commentary to recuperate this thought. So, how do we think with words? This is an important question. And if you think about words and the ways in which words travel, right, for those of us who have done degrees in English, degrees in history, and so on, if I were to use a word like différance, I mean, a lot of you might recognize it as coming from Derrida. If I were to use the word imaginary, you might recognize it as coming from Lacan. I could use Greek words like polis, kivitas. I could, or from Foucault, the idea of episteme. Right? All of these have traveled. And they've traveled because they are very much a part of a certain European inheritance of thinking. But what about words from our spaces that travel the other way, right? Each of these conceptual words that I've been talking about carry a whole history of commentary, of thinking, a genealogy, and so on and so forth. But the words that travel from our spaces, if you go travel in Europe and America, words like dharma travel, words like karma travel. Karma is a bitch, for example. I mean, so it's become the stuff of Archie cards, bumper stickers, things which are, I mean, when you think about these conceptual categories which have a huge history behind them, but they travel very easily because they're seen as being metaphors of our civilization, yin and yang, for example, or that idea of Ubuntu, which came into circulation after the end of apartheid, the idea of I am because you are, the notion of connectedness between human beings, which is seen as characterizing African thought. So the ideas and concepts that travel from our spaces are they're stripped of their histories. They become kind of emblematic of our spaces in ways that words that come to us from Europe and America don't. So what I want to do here is to go through a set of thinkers before I go on to talk about the latest book that I'm editing, which was an attempt to actually move away from critique to conversation, as I put it. So this book is the result of two conferences that I held in 2016 and 2018, where we got together over the space of these two conferences around 22 scholars who work with around 10 to 15 languages. And to each of them, I said, why don't you pick a word from the language that you work with, the language that you're familiar with, and think about the conceptual entailments of the language. So we have Shonalika Kaul from JNU who writes on the word kavya. We have William Pinch from Wesleyan who works on the idea of raj, to think about words which you might be familiar with, which come from an Indian classical tradition, but you have words in Wolof, words in Zulu, words in Xhosa, words in Arabic, Persian, Mandarin, and so on and so forth. So the idea was to think about creating a set of categories about which younger scholars who are working with this paradigm, right, the paradigm that we are attempting to recover from the colonial wound, who begin to take these words and say, look, how can we create a set of concepts that speak to our experience, are born of our experience, and have a resonance, right? A resonance within the spaces that we occupy. Now, obviously, once you move outside the space of the university in India, words like difference and imaginary have very little valence, very little purchase. So if you had to take words in Malayalam, for example, words in Hindi, there are words that cross over from the street into intellectual reflection, right? Constantly. And the work of J. Devika, for example, has been very consciously engaging with this idea of looking at words within spaces which carry a certain political and social weight, which are meaningful within a community, regardless of whether you are somebody who works in the fields, works in the factory, or teaches at a university, who lives at home, and so on and so forth. So it's to take up these words which circulate through these multiple spaces and to think, can we develop a conceptual vocabulary with them? So when I began on this enterprise, I thought, okay, what are the models that I can look to, right? Are there existing works like this? The answer, of course, is no. But what is the route that I took? So there was this wonderful book that came out earlier in the century by a Japanese historian and an anthropologist, American anthropologist, Anat Singh. I mean, they're both Americans, but one works in Japan, the other works on Southeast Asia, Anat Singh and Carol Gluck, which is called Words in Motion. Right? To think about this idea of how words travel, what words travel, right? And interestingly enough, if we are to think about the word rasa, for example, which is central to aesthetic theory, it's not a word that travels very easily. Recently, there's been a rasa reader edited by Sheldon Pollock, one of the foremost Sanskritists in the United States. Or think again about the Arab Spring of 2011, when in the Middle East and in North Africa, we had a whole series of uprisings. Right? And the Americans, of course, rejoiced and said, at last, democracy has come to these spaces. But what increasingly thinkers have been engaged, political scientists, historians have been engaged with these spaces found, is that they were drawing upon a larger Arabic cosmopolis, ideas that were going back to the Arab thinker Ibn Khaldun, right, a few centuries earlier, notions of asabiya or political solidarity within communities, that these were returning as people tried to forge new relationships as they were moving away from the dictatorships of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, moving away from the dictatorships in Algeria and Tunis and so on. But Western theory tended to see this as merely the travel of democracy. The word asabiya did not travel very well. It was too rooted in local circumstances. So when we think about words in motion, words that travel, in Anat Singh and Carol Gluck's book, they talk about how words like security, commission, reflecting certain kinds of bureaucratic and state concerns, secularism, how do they travel into spaces like Southeast Asia, India, and find a life here? Okay? But it must becomes immediately evident to you as I am speaking that these are concepts that have come from the West, like other concepts like class and so on. And the trajectory of travel of ideas is always from the West to the East, right? And so these ideas enter our spaces, there is a friction that they encounter, right? With local histories, they get translated in multiple ways. So if you think about the ways in which secularism, for example, is translated in India, it has multiple meanings. It means the equal respect for all religion. Some people see it as the absence of all religion. Some people say it's a state not supporting one religion and so on. So these ideas of secularism acquire multiple meanings because of the friction they encounter with local histories. Regardless of all of this, there is the idea of conceptual categories that travel one way. Those of you in an English department, you're certainly familiar with the work of Raymond Williams, right? The English Marxist literary critic. And he has this wonderful book called Key Words. And these are words in the English language used by the English, which are prevalent at any particular time in the vocabulary that is used within politics and thinking about society and thinking about the self. And he's very clear that this is not a dictionary. I mean, this is not like a sum of all the words that exist in the language, nor is it a glossary. A glossary is a kind of set of words that are relevant for understanding a particular paradigm. So let's say you have a novel using Malayalam words with a glossary, which picks up the Malayalam words which are relevant, which are there for understanding that novel in particular, for example. So it's neither a dictionary nor a glossary, but he calls it an inquiry into a vocabulary. That these words that he talks about are elements of problems. And these words are all in a relation to each other. They converse with each other. And what you have is when you write about a word, it's not a concern for clarity. So there is a word, when Raymond William writes about that word, it's not an attempt to show you what the word means, right? Like a dictionary would. What it does is to ask the question, what is the space within which this word acquires meaning? What other words is this word in conversation with? What are the multiple meanings, right, that are on debates that are generated by this word and so on? So it's actually a move from each word into a worldview, right? From each word into a space of thinking and conversation. So this is a very useful idea to think about when we think about developing a conceptual vocabulary, that words exist amidst social conflicts, amidst dreams of political emancipation. Words exist because they're all creating worlds, right? They're creating worlds that we would like to inhabit, worlds that we would like to leave behind, and so on and so forth. And the important thing here, of course, is that when we go back to traditions of thinking, whether it's in Malayalam, in Sanskrit, in Urdu, in Arabic, and so on within India, it's important to remember that you can't just go and pick up a word, right? So a very recent book that came out late last year by one of the foremost German scholars, Johannes Bronkhorst, who's written a reader on Shabda, the relation between language and reality in Sanskrit, in Indian classical thought. And he says that, look, you can't easily move into these vocabularies. It's like learning a language. It's not just like learning Sanskrit, but it's learning a language of thought. And when we engage with the words around us, these words are windows into modes of thinking, modes of living, and that is what requires us to think conceptually, that a word is a window into a world, right? And that's what we need to bear in mind, and nothing is clear, it's not transparent, right? So the word Shabda, for example, it stands at the heart of Johannes Bronkhorst's collation of Indian classical thought and language and reality, is merely a point of entry into a whole set of debates, right? So when we think about this, one of the things that we have to ask is, so is the idea of thinking about a word to render it transparent? So like A means B, all right? Or if you have a word and a word in, let's say, in Malayalam, Hindi, Urdu, and you say, well, this is the English equivalent, right, for this word. Sometimes there may not be English equivalent. Sometimes you might require a few essays or a book to connect it up with the kind of world of experience that English speakers might have. And very often, some words might be untranslatable, right? There is also that problem. Now, what do I mean by untranslatable? Sometimes untranslatability is a question of lethargy, intellectual lethargy. Right? Where you say, this word, only I can understand, only we can understand, you can't understand. This is a problem that every translator faces. But at some level, there are also words that are rooted in particular life worlds, particular experiences, and so on. So the question would be, how do we engage with words like this, which represent a quiddity or a thingness, right? They represent a particular hardness to interpretation, a hardness in terms of not being able to see through them into the workings of a society or the workings of the mind. The Caribbean thinker Edward Glisson calls this the right to opacity, right? Where he says that, look, it's not necessary that every word be translatable into the life worlds that exist elsewhere. So when we constantly think about this idea of talking back to Europe, it's not to make ourselves constantly transparent, right? So in the sense that if there is a word, we say, this is what it means in English, or this is what it means in French, that we need to retain the right to opacity. This is not about our languages being impenetrable in some sense, like some kind of radical autonomy, that only we have this word, only we understand it, but to understand the singularity of cultures, that we have to dwell on this. This is a matter of time. And this is the question that the French philosopher Barbara Cassin, when she talks about the idea of untranslatability, she relates it to time. And this is important, right? that the word that we are dealing with is not that it's impenetrable, untranslatable, it's a question of time, in the sense that thinking about this word produces a world of meanings that at some point might be able to make the leap, might be able to make that connection with other words elsewhere, or it may not, right? So the right to opacity, untranslatability, the question of time, these are all problems that we shall have to think about as we attempt to develop our own vocabulary. What Edward Glisson also talks about is this idea of archipelagic imaginations, right? As opposed to, if you think about the ways in which a dictionary is conceived, right? A nation comprises citizens, a dictionary comprises of words in the language, right? So there's a consolidated idea of an entity. But if you think about the Caribbean, you think about Indonesia, it's a set of islands scattered in the ocean. The unity that is imagined is an act of imagination, right? So when you think about those multiple islands in the Caribbean, they're held together by the act of imagination that sees Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, St. Lucia, and St. Kitts as part of the same entity. And he says that when we think about words again, what we need to understand is think about the connections between words that are established through an act of imagination, through the act of interpretation, that they need not necessarily be fundamentally connected as words within a particular language, which you can put into a dictionary safely or put into a glossary safely. So we have to think about this kind of archipelagic imagination. Now, why do I point this out? So when I edit this book, there are 22 writers working with 10 languages who have a set of words that they're all writing on. And somebody might well ask, this is a random collection of words, right? But for me, these are like putting together a set of words that begin to engage in conversations with each other and create through an archipelagic imagination a set of connections. That the connections between these words, their shared worlds, the shared interpretations, the borders of meaning, all of these emerge as these words are brought into relation with one another. It's like, to use a very crass example, it's like calling 15 people over to your house for a party. And it's at the end of 3 hours that a conversation begins to emerge as people find connections with each other. You might say, well, I will only invite my intimate friends and relatives to my party who already know each other. And then you might have the same conversation, gossip about neighbors, gossip about each other, and so on. But it's this bringing together, this unexpected bringing together of words and of people that actually spark off a different set of conversations. So I'd like to end here because I'm coming up to around 45 minutes with two words, right? Two words from the 22 words that I have put together. And what I'm doing here in this talk is actually trying to figure out an introduction to this volume. And so talking about the project actually allows me, and I hope there'll be questions on this, allows me to engage with these words as well. So the first word is from Zulu. And Zulu is one of the major languages of South Africa. And the second word is Urdu. Urdu is one of the major languages of northern India and indeed southern India as well. So the first word is a word in Zulu, Izitungutu. Now, this is a curious word because it arises in a particular encounter in the early 20th century where a British officer, James Stewart, is collecting the histories of words. I mean, so you have this whole project of creating dictionaries. So those of you in Kerala, you might remember Benjamin Bailey in Travancore, Gundert in Malabar, putting together dictionaries through a whole series of conversations that they engage in with people, looking at colonial records, looking at court records, and so on and so forth. So James Stewart begins his enterprise of putting together an English Zulu dictionary, and he's meeting with people and so on and so forth. This an old man who lives away from the city of Durban. He lives in the interior. He hears about this enterprise. An 80-year-old man called Tununu. He hears about James Stewart's enterprise. The railway has just started. So he takes a train, goes to Durban, to meet with James Stewart, and James Stewart is very excited. Here is this old man, a repository of wisdom connected to King Shaka, obviously connected to royalty and a whole set of histories that he's interested in, and they begin this conversation. But Tununu, after a while, says, look, he has this feeling of Isitungutu. So James Stewart writes it down in the dictionary, or in his notes, because he's not sure what this word means. And indeed, the word is no longer in use in Zulu right now. Right? It's a word that came out of an encounter at a particular point. Now, what did Tununu mean when he used the word saying that I am Isitungutu? And one of the things that he tells James Stewart is that, look, you are asking me all of these questions, right? And you want an answer. And you say, what is the word for law? What is the word for love in Zulu? What is the word for justice in Zulu? And so on. So these are not my questions. The questions that you ask are not my questions. And the questions that you ask are not the questions that I would ask of my language. And the meanings that I am concerned with are in no way related to the questions in your mind. Right? Now, this is a wonderful example of cross-cultural conversation, or the lack of conversation, where Easy Tungutu becomes the very problem that we're trying to handle in this lecture. Right? So when we talk about commensurability, right, that there are certain problems in the world, French theory has thought about it this way, English theory has thought about it this way, German theory has thought about it this way, and then we bring that wholesale into our society and use those same questions here. We don't experience Isi Tungutu like Tununu does. What Tununu is asking us is to do, to give pause, is to ask, are those questions our questions? Or do we need another set of questions? And if you have another set of questions, does that vocabulary and do those questions any longer serve us in this whole process of understanding and interpretation? The second word, that is a word that a lot of you would be familiar with. This is an essay the first essay was written by John Wright and Cynthia Cross. John Wright has spent around 30 years working with the James Stewart archives. And so this word is something that he knows about. It's not there in common everyday parlance. The second essay is written by Professor Francesca Orsini, who is Italian but who teaches Hindi in the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And she writes an essay on the word Aukat. Aukat is related to status, related to hierarchy. Very often, in northern India at least, the word is used in a very confrontational manner. When somebody does something, then you say, "Tumhari aukat kya hai?" Now, what is your status that you can do this? What is your status that you can say this? What is your status that you can be in my presence? And so on and so forth. So the word aukat immediately establishes a hierarchy of those in possession of power and those without the right to engage in that field of power at all. Interestingly enough, the word aukat has its root in the word waqt, right, which means time. So this leads Francesca to a very interesting exposition of the relation between status and time. This is a word, unlike any in English, that brings together the question of status and time in one word. That status is indeed a matter of time, right? And then she goes on to speaking about, she moves from the 19th century dictionaries, where she looks at the philology and the etymology of these words, to contemporary Uttar Pradesh, where the rise of Dalit movement since the 1990s has meant that the question of Aukat had acquired a different meaning. So increasingly, and it's important for us to think about Uttar Pradesh right now, considering the events that have happened at Hathras, the police intervention that has led to the burning of the young girl's body, the continuing attacks on Dalits that have been happening with impunity, to use a word from the social theorist V. Geeta, who writes from Tamil Nadu, that India is characterized by impunity. Right? People can just do whatever they want and they can get away with it. Everyone's above the law, particularly if they come from the right caste, have the right connections. So the growth of Dalit movements has also meant that a significant, if you think about somebody like Chandrasekhar Azad, for example, the word Aukat also allows the Dalit to say what is your awkath to the upper caste? Right? It's a matter of time, right? Status is a matter of time, where the Dalit asks the Brahmin or the Thakur, what is your awkath that you can oppress me? This is a question that we had a long ago in Kerala when the communist, when starting off from Narayana Guru to the communist mobilizations in Malabar and so on, where large numbers of peasants in northern Malabar would approach these big landlords, enemies, Karakatidatil Nayanar and so on, God's on earth, and say, who are you to take away my land, right? Where the question of Aukat had been suddenly turned on its head. The question of power and hierarchy had been turned on its head. So the time has come for us as decolonized people, people trying towards a decolonial thinking where we are trying to emancipate our minds now that our territories are emancipated. India is an independent country. When we attempt to decolonize our minds, arrive at decolonial thinking, that we need to engage with creating a newer conceptual vocabulary which accords with our history, with our experience, and with the desire that we cannot continue to write our histories with histories that come from elsewhere. As Tagore said way back in 1917, more than 100 years ago. And there's a wonderful essay that I would recommend to all of you by one of India's most important philosophers, K.C. Bhattacharya, who again wrote this essay way back in 1928 called Swaraj in Ideas. And what he was saying in that is that we need to have distinctly Indian estimates of Western literature and thought, right? And we have to recover from that colonial wound where we live after amnesia. What would it mean to remember? That is the question that I'll leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip sir. Yeah, it was really an engaging session, in fact. As somebody, as teachers and students of literature who has caught up in this aura of colonialism for some time, I remember what Gugi Walk the uncle once said, you should shut down all the English departments and and search for something very original and native.
That's not something that I would recommend in your case. You don't want to be unemployed in the time of COVID.
Okay, exactly. But sir, it was really an engaging session, and the way you have exposed the idea of thinking from the south was so fresh. In fact, it has actually a kick on our amnesia, on our native thought and the intellectual traditions we all have. So I think the floor is open now, and I'll begin with a question which I thought while listening to your talk. In fact, so you were talking about thinking about our traditions, thinking about our culture. How could we actually get out of the so-called what do you call the Hindutva ideology, which have been for grounding this idea of going back or going or thinking through Ramayanas or thinking through Mahabharata and for grounding a particular culture, a particular way of thought. So, do you think is there a danger of looking back our culture or foregrounding our idea of Sanskritization or looking at our languages like Sanskrit? Is there a problem of what do you call the resurgence of our older hierarchies or caste systems or something like that? In fact, which is being emerging in a new form these days.
Right. It depends on who we look to as a model for our theoretical and political enterprise. We could certainly look to the BJP, right, which is an uncritical appropriation of the Indian past, which looks at the Indian past as being glorious and golden, forgets hierarchy, forgets the inegalitarianism and violence that lies at the heart of our society, and merely creates a bubble of self-admiration in order to present it to the West. Right? Or we can go the way of Ambedkar, or we can go the way of Phule, we can go the way of Periyar, a whole host of thinkers who have engaged with the Indian past in order to realize the emancipatory strains within it. When Ambedkar looks back to the past, he's not looking to Manu's Dharmashastra as a model. He's looking at Buddhism, right? And Buddhism's embrace of a radical equality, Buddhism's embrace of rationalism, Buddhism's central idea of Maitri, of fraternity, where Ambedkar is very clear that you can have a constitution which can legislate equality, it can legislate liberty, but it cannot legislate fraternity. There is no reason for me to treat you with respect or treat you as a person who needs dignity. You can't legislate that. You have to create a state of mind. And you have the wonderful historian Uma Chakravarti, who, in response to some of these appropriations of the ancient, glorious Indian past, wrote a wonderful essay called Whatever Happened to the Vedic Dasi, right? Asking, so when you talk about this golden age of Hinduism in the past, you have to reckon with the fact that women were treated as inhuman, right? As subordinate humans, rather. And so how do we reckon with that history? So when one says that one has to go back to our traditions, whether it's traditions of thinking in Buddhism, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Jainism, and so on, we have to recover from them that which is relevant for the present, that is relevant to projects of justice, relevant to projects of equality, and most important, relevant to projects of fraternity in India. Right? It can't be a sentimental and forgetful recovery of the past.
Now, I think you can raise your questions. You can either unmute your mic and speak, or you can post your questions in the chat section below. So I could see a few questions here.
So there's one question about how can we identify real history, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what exactly is meant by real history,
Yeah.
except for the fact that one could possibly say that there are two things here. If you think about what I began with, where Bankim Chandra says India needs a history, India doesn't have a history. What we have are all of these chronologies and these stories of the past and vast notions of time and so on and so forth. So slowly we move towards an understanding of a historical discipline. Right? And a historical discipline has an idea of a source, there is the idea of an archive, there are certain protocols of truth and untruth, what is considered a fact, and so on and so forth. But these protocols of history writing and the protocols of the history discipline also come with an ideological baggage. They don't just come with procedures. So then we have the protocols also making us divide our historical periods into ancient, medieval, and modern. And this is not just temporal categories, they're not categories of time. Right? The medieval becomes the dark age, just as Europe had the dark age with all those invasions that were happening from the Huns to the Goths. The medieval period in India is seen as the Muslim period. It's a period of darkness, right? As opposed to the modern period, which might be the period of colonialism, but then we learned ideas of freedom, etc., etc., etc. So the historical discipline, the real history that we are taught at the universities, right, and in the schools, also comes with its problems. But at the same time, what we have not begun to engage with are the multiple historical imaginations that exist beside this. So this is a book that I am writing right now, and I've published a series of essays where I'm looking at Malayali figures, right, who are not historians, who write histories. Right? Now, to say that history is that which is written by historians is what is called a tautology. Right? It doesn't really it's not very illuminating to say that. So I look at figures like Kesari Balakrishna Pillai, who's a literary critic, Chattambi Swamigal, who's a religious figure, K.P. Padmanabha Menon, who's a lawyer, Kanipayur Shankaran Namburipad, who's a expert in Tachashastram, and of course EMS, who's a Marxist ideologue and politician, but also an intellectual. All of them write histories of Kerala. Right? And no historian within the historical discipline will recognize these as histories because the kinds of sources used, the kinds of arguments that are being made are very different from what the historical profession does. So if you speak to an average historian in Kerala, they'll say, Kesari Balakrishna is an antiquarian. He's not a historian. All these hierarchies are created. But what I'm interested in is the question of how all of them, given their multiple differences, so Kanipayur begins his history of Kerala in Central Asia. Kesari Balakrishna begins his history of Kerala with regard to ancient Rome. K.P. Padmanabha Menon's history of Kerala is connected up with the Dutch. There are multiple geographies, but all of them bring up this category of anubhava or experience. That there is something that of our historical experience that exceeds what is present in the historical archive. Because the historical archive is, after all, created for us by colonialism, right? So if you ask the question, where are we in this archive, it's a wrong kind of question, because the idea of colonialism was not to capture the everyday lives and thoughts of Indians. It was about administration, it was about law and order, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about real history, a real history will be able to bring these two together. The question of the historical imaginations, multiple historical imaginations, alongside the historical discipline and its questions. So to end with one very piquant example for you, if you think about the NCERT textbooks, the earlier NCERT textbooks, not the post-2005, post-2005, there were multiple revisions that were engaged in. So most of you may have heard of the historian Sumit Sarkar, right, who wrote a wonderful history of modern India. So his son was going to school studying the NCERT textbooks, and the NCERT textbooks were written in a very secular fashion. And the secular fashion meant that the interpretation given of the Mapala rebellion in Malabar was that in the Mapala rebellion, Hindus and Muslims fought as one. Right? So Sumit Sarkar's son, Aditya, comes home and asks them, so who were they fighting against if they fought as one? Right? So this demand of secularism meant that a lot of historical experience was being occluded. Because during the Mapla rebellion, Hindus fought against Muslims, Muslims fought against Hindus, Hindus and Muslims fought against the British, and so on. There were multiple histories. But the NCERT textbook, given the protocol of secularism, could not address that. It became reduced to a simple formula: Hindus and Muslims fought as one, leading to Aditya's question at the age of 11, who were they fighting against? Right? So I think this question of real history is an important question. We have to think about as to how we are to write a history that will create a much larger landscape, a truer landscape, that will bring in histories of hierarchy and violence and inegalitarianism as much as freedom.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Anu Rahim is. Yeah.
There's another question. The idea of national language rises standard books apart from colonialism. Sorry, I'll go quickly through these. Somebody's asked about the title of the book. This will come out next year. It's from Routledge. It's called Changing Theory, Concepts from the Global South, which was the title of this talk. Can we relate decolonizing to de-Brahminizing also in Indian context? Excellent question, and I would agree that in some sense, decolonizing the imagination also means de-Brahminizing in the sense of this is not an attack on a Brahmin as a person, but the fact that a lot of our sociology and our history writing has been dominated by upper caste. There is a wonderful project that's being engaged in from the University of Leeds, which is trying to write a history of Indian sociology and looking at the large numbers of people of upper caste who produced understandings of Indian society, which have meant that their understandings have been slightly flawed. So to give you one example again, one of the examples that, or one of the processes that we're all taught, all the way through school, college, and so on, is this idea of Sanskritization, which is the idea put forward by the Brahmin sociologist M.N. Srinivas. The idea of Sanskritization is basically argues that those who belong to lower castes over a period of time change their practices, their diet, their forms of speech, and their forms of dress in order to become more like the upper caste. Right? And that's the process of Sanskritization. And this is what is seen as social transformation in modern India. Right? Now, you might ask yourself, there are multiple ways in which social transformation happens, and one is a rejection of all of this. A rejection of upper caste values. It's not just conformity with upper caste values. The other tragedy is that conformity with upper caste values can result in death, as we have seen in the case of Dalits who try to grow mustaches, wear leather slippers, and can be killed and burned. Right? So the idea of Sanskritization is a Brahminical idea about a slow, wonderful transformation of society where given time, upper caste will become, the lower caste will become like the upper caste, and there'll be no problem. Everyone will be vegetarian, Malayalis won't eat beef anymore, and we should be a sad and progressive society. Right? So I think this question of de-Brahmanizing is an important one. When we need to think about, and we need to decolonize the ways in which we've understood Indian history and sociology within India as well, apart from this external relation that I've been talking about. The other history is something that is crucial. And when the years that I taught at the University of Hyderabad were the most exciting years for me because I could see that happening in the university. There was a de-Brahmanizing of the disciplines that was happening where people were asking, what are the origins of this idea? Where does this idea lead? What are the experiences that this idea excludes? Where am I in the sociology? And these were Dalit students asking these questions. So there is a whole process of decolonization / de-Brahmanization that needs to happen in India. And that's what we are seeing in the universities. And we're also seeing the backlash against that. Right? The suicide of Rohit Vemula is the crystallizing element that shows us the heart of the struggle, right? Where there is a reaction that happens at any move to change the disciplines as they're constituted. Sorry, Rajesh, are there any more questions? I mean, my scrolling function.
Yes, there are quite a number of questions. Yeah. Sir, you mentioned about Chinese Yin and Yang. Would you please elaborate on how these concepts are applicable?
Now, I'm not an expert on Chinese philosophy. Those of you who are interested, there's a wonderful Chinese or wonderful American philosopher who works on Chinese philosophy called Brian Van Norden. That's Van Norden. And he has these introductions to Chinese philosophy, which you can look at. He's also somebody I'm in conversation with because he has this wonderful idea of what would it mean to have a multicultural philosophy. Right? Where when we say philosophy, it's not French and German alone, but it's a philosophy that includes Arabic, French, German, Chinese, Indian, and how do we bring all of this into conversation with each other? And for those of you who are further interested in this issue, I would recommend a super website, which is called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. So if you Google History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, this is hosted by Professor Peter Adamson, who's in Munich. And what he does is that he's a historian of Arabic philosophy, but he says that, look, just studying Arabic philosophy by itself is not enough. What is the universe within which this conversation happens? So he engages Indian philosophers, Chinese philosophers, French philosophers, and so on in conversation. So this website, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, gives you an idea of how to do a real philosophy, right? Where, which is truly engaging with a human enterprise. This thing of the African ecocentric beyond the animate and inanimate, Aryan and Dravidian philosophies. See, when we talk about Indian philosophy, again, I think we must have a broader understanding of the binaries of Aryan and Dravidian, because India is a space that is a contention of ideas that come from Islam, from Jainism, from Buddhism. There are popular Bhakti movements, Sufi movements. So we have a whole landscape of thinking which we can't reduce to binaries of any kind. The second thing to think about is that when we say Indian philosophy, we also have to ask ourselves that the question of what does it mean to talk about India, right? I mean, India came into existence on 15th August 1947, right? It's a very recent entity. It's a bit like saying Kerala. Kerala is 1st November 1956. Before that, it was a different geography, and India and Kerala was incorporated into the rhythms of the Indian Ocean, which is why Kesari Balakrishna begins his history of Kerala with Rome 1,000 years ago, because that was part of Kerala's geography. And a lot of younger scholars have also begun to ask the question of Islam in India, where again, a lot of the Bharatiya Janata Party's impoverished understandings of Islam deal with Mahmud of Ghazni, Muslim invasion, and so on and so forth. And even Akbar comes in for a severe knocking. But there are younger historians like Mahmoud Kuria and Yasser Arafat, who teaches at the University of Delhi, who are part of a larger enterprise to look at Indian Ocean Islam, right, which brings in the history of Islam not only in the Middle East but Southeast Asia, where India is a place through which multiple currents of Islam are flowing, just as much as multiple currents of other religions are flowing. So when we say Indian philosophy, we have to keep in mind that this is a heuristic definition. Heuristic meaning we're doing this for explanatory reasons. It's not that there is an entity that extends from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Manipur to Gujarat, that is India. That's a very recent idea. Before that, there were these multiple flows. About the other idea of eco-criticism and thinking about the human and the non-human, this is another big question, right? It's another big question, probably demands several other lectures as well, because obviously this particular lecture that I've done deals with the question of creating a social theory that is more aware of the ideas of inequality and freedom within a human landscape. The other book that I'm editing with a former postdoctoral fellow, Malayali, Nisha, PR Nisha, is on transnational histories of the circus, right? Where we are trying to look at. Nisha wrote a wonderful book on the history of the circus, which is out from Oxford University Press this year. And this book that I'm editing with Nisha looks at the movement of animals and humans across the globe in the late 19th and the early 20th century, where we are addressing in the introduction the question of what does it mean to think about the world not through only the human, but to think about the human and the animal together. Right? And this is the enterprise that we have to engage in also because of the ways in which we have destroyed the world. And those of you who watched that, for me, the one person who has never got the Nobel Prize but should have been given several is David Attenborough, right? Who at the age of 93 continues to engage passionately with the world and every creature in it, from insect to plant to human and so on. And there's one episode in his earlier, he's got a more recent film which is a testament to 93 years of his life on the planet. There's an earlier one where he has an episode on Chernobyl. And as you know, in April 1986, there was the nuclear reactor exploded, and Chernobyl becomes uninhabitable because of the presence of radioactivity. There are no humans. There are abandoned buildings. And what has happened as a result of that is that nature has come back in. And Chernobyl is now green and verdant, luscious. Animals which had ceased to exist have all come back in. The Przewalski's horse, which is an extinct species, is now bounding around in numbers. He talks about the wolves who have come back. Wolves come back because they're animals to eat, hunt and eat. And then you begin to think about the irrelevance of humans. When once humans leave, the landscape becomes much more verdant, much more exciting. And in many senses, the earth reclaims, or nature reclaims the earth. So these are questions which are very broad and probably need another set of lectures. But I'm glad somebody brought this up because, in some sense, these are very limited human concerns that I've been talking about in this in this talk. It's a very focused talk. But certainly, we need to think about the animal and the human, right? Animal, human, insect, plants, all of it together in the era of narcissistic idea of the Anthropocene, that the human being created the world and the human being will destroy it. Sorry, I'm just peering at these questions.
So it's from
Yep.
M. Nivagi, sir. The project of
Yes.
the project of rediscovering a new set of keywords sourced from
And
the
Edward,
yeah.
right, I'm reading that. Edward Said's ideas of traveling theory have been done by hegemonic systems. Liberal. Yes, and this is a very important point, I think, that Mr. G. Varghese has raised, that we have to create a set of contending vocabularies because we have a new set of universal vocabularies that are emerging out of the neoliberal capitalism, which seek to define the world in terms of, so if you think about words like empowerment, right, which are now used largely by the World Bank, right, rather than by these spaces within which these words actually originated, that we have a whole series of vocabularies that are generated, which are individualizing people, which are trying to curtail forms of dissent, which are trying to create a flat world through which capital can traverse. And what we do need to do in terms of our evolving our conceptual vocabulary is also to be aware of the terrain of capitalism, right? Which is a word that hasn't come up in these discussions. But that terrain of capitalism within which we function, where radical ideas themselves become consumables, right? So words like empowerment become the vocabulary which is used by Nike as much as an Adivasi. Right? So we have to think about that. And so in that sense, creating a conceptual vocabulary, we also have to think about the field within which it's being created and the kind of resonances that the vocabulary that we create may have with the attempts of power to subordinate people. And one of the most significant theorists of the resistance to this landscape of neoliberal capitalism, who died recently, David Graeber, the anthropologist. Those of you who have not read his 5,000 Years of Debt should read it. All of these books are now available on illegal websites. So regardless of whether you're in Wayanad or in Princeton, you can read the same books, right? So if anyone wants to know the name of any illegal website, ask Rajesh. He's smiling knowledgeably. So he obviously knows the same websites as I do. But all of these books, so David Graeber is one of the most significant theorists who actually addresses this issue of the co-opting of vocabularies, right? Of the co-opting of radical vocabularies within a larger space of political conservatism under the dispensation of neoliberal capitalism. I think those, Vidya Vishwanathan. Who's in the next question, Rajesh?
It's you mentioned words in motion. So words acquire significations depending on the status of time and space. It is
from a number. It's a
a
bot.
number. Yeah.
So, yes, words in motion acquire different significance depending on the status of time and space. Yes, I mean, see, words are, and that's one of the things that I was pointing to as well, that a word like secularism travels and acquires different meanings. It has one set of meanings within a space like France, another set of meanings in a space like India. And even within India, the understanding of secularism has changed considerably. Some of you are too young, perhaps, to remember, or maybe old enough to remember the debates that went on between T.N. Madan, the sociologist, and Ashish Nandi about the relevance of the word secularism in the Indian context. T.N. Madan arguing that secularism didn't have much purchase in Indian society because ideas of secularism didn't exist in Indian languages. So, how are we to translate the word secularism? Is it Sarva Dharma Samabhav, and so on and so forth? Multiple. So, the idea of words in motion is not only the words traveling from one space to another, right, from Europe to India, but the words traveling within India and the meaning that secularism had in the 1980s being very different from the meanings that the word secularism has now. The word secularism is a bad word right now, right? The pseudo-secular is what immediately comes to mind when somebody says secular. Right? So when we think about words, that's why Raymond Williams is crucial, because he says that an easy attempt at clarity will lead us nowhere. Words are constantly changing. Words change with time. And those of you who are interested in particularly in new times creating new words, this kind of idea, the works of the German philosopher, the things that we have to then think about when we think about issues of color, right? And fair and lovely, which is mentioned here in this question, is that feminism exists in a field in India of multiple hierarchies of caste, class, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. It's the idea of intersectionality. That to address only patriarchy is not sufficient. We have to address patriarchy, class, caste, and so on and so forth. So very often the kind of divisions that appear in any movement reflect the other hierarchies within society. So there is a large area in Kerala, again, I mean, even though we're a very progressive society, there is an acceptance of the hierarchy of color, right? Of our actresses are all fair. Kuku Parameswaran or Sajita might be like outliers in our understanding, but they're not certainly leading heroines. So we have to ask ourselves, how progressive are we as a society in Kerala? What are the ways in which we need to think about? It's not merely the deployment of fair Tamilian actresses or fair Malayali actresses on the screen, but what is the structure of aspirations within a society that grants a particular status to fairness? What are the ideas underlying it? Right? So if you think about the recent Tanishq ad that was banned, right, and it's a hugely unfortunate incident, the result of trolling by Hindu fundamentalists and so on, but everybody in that ad was milky white. Right? I don't think any of my friends have that complexion. Right? I haven't seen people like that except in advertisements. So that is another question to ask about the deep underlying tensions in our society where we are unwilling to accept that we are brown. We want to see ourselves as white, wheat, and fair. I mean, this is something that, when I was teaching in Delhi University, I say we don't need courses in Indian sociology. Every sociology course should just consist of a reading of matrimonial advertisements, where the fact that Indians will not marry one another is made very clear. The fact that caste will not marry one another is made very clear. The notions of pulchritude, of beauty, are made very clear. The notions of morality are made very clear. All kinds of every flaw in Indian society is evident in a matrimonial advertisement. So anyway, but that's a kind of aside on a very important question of, because color is code for caste, right? Which is why our comedians in Malayalam cinema are dark. Right? Think about Salim Kumar, fine actor, but he will play comic roles. Achan Orangatha Veede, anybody who's seen that film will know what a fine actor he is. But he will be given comic roles because he's dark skinned, the idea of dark skin and casteness, right? And so on and so forth. So I think, this is another set of lectures to be delivered by film theorists. And this is something that's shared by art cinema and commercial cinema in Kerala. It's not only...
Next is from Tom, sir. Yeah.
Decolonized mindset and the result deterritorialization entail universal fraternity and Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. See, this question of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam is a philosophical idea that was conceived of within a particular social order and by a particular social group. It did not, the idea of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam certainly did not include the Nishada and the Dalit. Right? And the idea of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, as it's being summoned up by BJP Hindutva, also does not include the untouchable, it does not include the Muslim. Right? So we have to understand that these are ideal type notions. And this is not to do away with the idea or to dismiss the radical power of this idea. What would it mean for us to truly think about the world as one family? Think about the relation of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam with the idea of Maitri, which Ambedkar speaks about. If the entire world is one's family, then the person who is dark-skinned, the person between men and women, between castes, between religions, there will not be any space of friction. That we look at each other as human involved in the common project of building a more just humanity. Right? That is the aspiration. This cannot be a fallback option, where to say that Hindus are a non-violent people, we believe in Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, and so on, and set aside the fact that, that we have violence all around us. There is fire all, burning all around us, but we are safe in our, in the very. I remember at one time Amritanandamai said something. "Karingal gonda veedundaki," that a granite house within which we live and think, but there are fires all around us. Right? The fact that we won't burn is the only concern. And I think that is the idea, the heart of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as it's conceived of now. It's the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam existing alongside a landscape of hierarchy, violence, and inegalitarianism, which renders the very idea meaningless and fatuous, right? And only giving us an idea of a sentimental idea of being a Hindu, right? Being proud to be Hindu. What is there to be proud? We have to fight for it, right? So those kinds of issues. Is there... When we rely on Eastern aesthetics, will it not be a move towards Sanskritic ideology? Not at all, right? It depends. This is something that I've been speaking about. I mean, the whole landscape of intellectual resources available to us. This is not to say that we must not look at Sanskritic sources at all, but it exists alongside in conversation. And increasingly, we've seen a lot of early modern work. I mean, works on early modern India, particularly on the Mughal court, which look at philosophers, Hindu philosophers working with Sanskrit, and Muslim philosophers working with Persian Arabic, who are in conversation with each other. Right? When you think about the image of Shuko, the shadow figure of Aurangzeb, the man who never became emperor, Dara Shuko, who was interested in the Upanishads, who was interested in Sufi ideology, where did all of this knowledge come from? It came from a conversation that existed between philosophical traditions in India, of which he was the exemplar. Right? But that Dara Shuko loses out in the race for succession within the Mughal Empire is another story. But we have to ask ourselves about these figures as well, who thought about India in the sum of its thinking, not from particular religious, caste, or ethnic standpoints. I think that was the last question.
Yeah. So I have one more question, in fact.
Yeah, please.
The idea of colonial critic, if you look at some African thinkers, they always connect colonialism with Christianity. There is an element of religion there. But when it comes to the critique of colonialism in India, in fact, very rarely, critics look at the connection between colonialism and Christianity. In fact, you made a passing reference. I mean, we have a Hindu culture, we have Muslim culture, but colonialism is not equated with Christian culture. And why that particular phenomena is so? If my observation is right.
It's an important question, and it's a large question, and I'll try and answer it briefly, because Christopher Bailey, who is a historian at Cambridge, had a wonderful essay on this where he talks about how the Protestant Empire, he very deliberately calls it the Protestant Empire of the British, managed to create an idea of itself as being a neutral arbiter between communities. Right? So it invisibilized its Christianity in order to project itself as the figure standing at the center of resolving Hindu-Muslim conflict. So that's one set of issues about Protestant. We have to think about colonial power as being Protestant. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Gauri Vishwanathan, who teaches at Columbia, who wrote a book called Masks of Conquest, which asked a very simple question. Till around the 1980s, English literature syllabi in India, across colleges, across regions, besides studying Chaucer and Tennyson and all of that, the Bible was also taught in an English literature course. Now, we know the Bible is not written in English, right? It is written in Hebrew. It's only in the 17th century that you have the King James translation emerging, right? And that's the King James translation is the one that's generally used, and then you have multiple other renditions. So why was the Bible at the heart of the English literature syllabus? So the book actually looks at how the first chair of English literature is actually set up in Calcutta. It's not in England. Right? So Charles Grant, the missionary, is involved in the setting up of the first chair in English literature in India. And the idea of putting the Bible in the English literature course was that of training the mind. So you read Shelley, you read Tennyson, you read Chaucer, and you Shakespeare, and you trained your affect to a better understanding of the Bible. So in fact, what was being taught in English literature was the Bible. All the other texts were just adjunct to this major enterprise. So that's another example to think with. Yet another example to think with is if you think about the ways in which Christianity offers a space of critique. So when I translated Saraswati Vijaya, right, written by Potheri Kunyambu, at the heart of it is the Basel Mission enterprise of Christianity affording a critique of caste. And there's a wonderful dialogue in the middle of the book where there are, so do temples provide for education? Do temples provide for hospitals? And so on and so forth. So what is the larger enterprise of religion, Hindu religion? Is it just to have hierarchy or is it to look after everybody? So Christianity provides a critique which then becomes central to a dispersion of ideas of equality, which find its way into even enterprises that are not directly engaging with Christianity. And so if you read Ambedkar too, you'll find echoes of his reading of the Bible. So this is something, and it's very interesting how this surfaces. If you read what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables, which is a study or critique of Gandhi, it's also an attempt to understand the whole process of elections and money laundering and Gandhi's undue influence and so on. It begins in the preface with a note written to a lady talking about their readings of the Bible together. Right? And so you can see that many of these ideas of equality come to him from a reading of the Bible as well. But he says very clearly that where we differ is that for me, a modern society is a society without God. Right? That's what Ambedkar says. So the Bible is present in his thinking, it informs his thinking, but it's something that exists alongside other modes of thinking. So we have to think about the various ways in which Christianity figures, right? And there's a series that I edit, and this is my last point. There's a series that I edit for Routledge, which is called Pathfinders. And it's a series of short books on individuals who we ought to know more about and we don't. So the latest book will come out in December or January this is, written by an excellent scholar, Deepra Dandekar. And it's about Baba Padmanji. Baba Padmanji was a Maharashtrian Brahmin who converted to Christianity in the 19th century, and he writes arguably one of the first Indian novels, right, in the mid-19th century. The novel is called Yamuna Paryatan, and it's about the travels of Yamuna, who's a widow, Paryatan as in travel, right? And you'd recognize the Sanskritic root. So Yamuna, once she's widowed, travels a landscape where she discovers widowhood everywhere. And it's this idea that blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, which is central to Christianity, never acted upon, right? When you think about the power of churches and you think about all of that, I mean, that is in its place. But blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. It directs your eyes downward. It directs your eyes to a landscape of oppression, of deprivation, of inequality. And so when Baba Padmanji writes his novel, his gaze falls on the widow, who, regardless of whether she's Brahmin or Dalit, is at the bottom of the hierarchy. A widow existed in Bengal to be burnt. Right? It was not even a subhuman creature. So, in that sense, Christianity brings in a very contemporary critique of that landscape of inequality that is central to India, which continues, right, to the present. We haven't redeemed ourselves through independence one whit. Right? There is a way in which we have a huge distance to go. And so the question that you asked is, and which is why I think the Bharatiya Janata Party is so insistent on its attempts to deny the power of Christian thinking in India. Think about the brutal murder of Graham Staines, which will stand as a scar on modern India's conscience. And anyway, there are multiple issues to be dealt with here. But I think that lesson, the blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, you can translate that. Blessed are the Dalits, for they shall inherit the earth. What would that mean for a politics of India? It will connect up with many of the questions that were asked of me.
Sorry, in fact, it is 7:30 right now. 2 hours have gone very quickly. I couldn't see any questions. Is there any questions, Suman? I think they can.
Okay, this is the last thing here. I mean, Vibha Joshi has pointed to Peter Pandevir's book, Imperial Encounter, an excellent book. Thank you, and I think many of you will benefit by reading it.
So, Johnson sir, if there is no question, I think it's time to say goodbye. I think we can stop the session.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dilip sir, it was really an engaging, really engaging, and I had read Ashish Nandi, Sudipta Kaviraj, and Parthaji, and so on for my PhD dissertation, and it was a wonderful opportunity to revisit them and their concepts once again. I hope these ideas emerging somehow transform understanding of the very being of the Indian culture and the Indian civilization. I take this opportunity to thank you so much for being with us, for having given this wonderful lecture. And I'm sure that it must have enlightened the minds of the young scholars and the faculty who are present here. And I hope this will, guide all of us perhaps to think in this line. And I also remember listening to Professor Avatesh Kumar Singh, who has also been talking about the kind of thought that has to emerge from the Indian context. So I hope this will lead to further research, new papers, and new inquiries. And I take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of the Department of English of Sacred College and all the participants who are present here. Thank you so much. And I thank Dr. Rajesh James, who in fact contacted Dilip sir and then anchored the session today and made all the other preparations. I also thank my other colleagues who have done their role in making this session possible, particularly Dr. Aravind R. Nair, who is working behind to make this presentation possible. And I also take this opportunity to thank each and every one of our participants. And we are very happy to say that we have been organizing seminars of this kind, lectures, and we always have our participants there, and our students, our faculty members from neighboring colleges and other institutions, and even they have been regular the seminars we are organizing, and I take this opportunity to thank each one of them. And I also would like to say that we will be coming up with a few seminars in November. We have a series of 4 lectures coming up, and I request all the participants to join us for the first lecture on November 4th. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Dilip sir, since you come every year for the Kochi Biennale, I think our college is very close to that space. So please come to our college also.
No, I shall. I mean, it's good to have this huge landscape of expanding landscape of friends. So I believe the Kochi Biennale, I mean, I was in conversation with the organizers. It won't be held this year. It's most probably going to be postponed now. So mid-year may not work, but it may happen in 2021 December. But let's keep our fingers crossed.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed this conversation. Bye, Rajesh. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. രാജേഷേ ഞാൻ